Good morning and hello and welcome to today's webinar officially launching the Trends 2024 report on European higher education institutions in times of transition. My name is Henriette Stoeber and I'm joined today by my colleagues Gaebel and Thérèse Zhang. We are all from EUA's Higher Education Policy Unit and we will take you through some of our key findings of the Trends report. Before we delve into the webinar though, the usual housekeeping and background information, you can see here on the slide several ways of joining the conversation, and we very warmly encourage you to do so as well. First of all, there's the chat function. Here you can say hello, where you're from, what institution you're from, and perhaps also whether you responded to the Trends survey that we had running in 2023. There's, more importantly, the Q&A section where you can ask questions to our speakers, join the discussion with comments and so on. And here I would like to point out that your questions in the Q&A section will not be instantly posted to other participants, but we actually pre-review them and then publish them to everyone else. Once you see questions appearing in the Q&A, you can also hit a little like button, and this way the question will move upwards and it makes it easier for me as the moderator to pick it up and address the question to our speakers today. This webinar also includes a couple of poll questions where you can participate as well. And last but not least, you will receive the usual post-webinar survey to give us our feedback on today's event and perhaps give us some ideas for future EUA webinars. I hope most of you already know the European University Association very well. We are a membership association currently bringing together almost 900 members in the countries of the European higher education area. As you can see here on the map, in many of those countries, these membership includes, on top of higher education institutions, also the national level rectors conferences. Those are depicted here in light blue color. EUA Trends is a report series that we call a milestone publication really for EUA. We've been doing this publication since 1999. Trends 2024 is the 9th edition of this report series. And in this report, we're basically mapping the developments and everything that is important to our higher education institutions in the European higher education landscape. We try to gather comparative data. I already mentioned that for Trends, we always run a large-scale survey, and we really try to gather the perspectives of the sector towards international and national policy reforms, linked also to the reforms in the Bologna process and in the EHEA. And just to mention that EUA has been a member of the Bologna process, a consultative member since its beginning. We very actively participate in pretty much all of the activities of the EHEA, such as the Bologna follow-up group, its working groups, advisory groups, and so on. And in taking part in the discussions in the Bologna process, Trends really forms one of the bases for our contribution. Moving on then to the 2024 edition of the report. Here on the slide, you can see the link to the report if you haven't downloaded it yet. It is also available in the platform Steven that we are using, and you might have already seen it when you came into this webinar. I would also like to point out that for the first time ever, we are actually issuing the data set for your own research purposes in an open access format on the Zendu platform, and also the link is on the slide here. The slides will, of course, be shared with you after the webinar. Trends 2024 managed to reach almost 500 higher education institutions. The responses came mainly from leadership portfolios, and we cover 45 higher education systems in the EHEA. Overall, the survey and its report, and of course, issues longitudinal data in various ways. For instance, we try as often as we can to compare to 2015 and 2018 Trends data sets, but we also link the data to other thematic surveys, such as the ones that we carried out in projects on digitalization, on inclusion, and so on. You can see here the sections that we address in the survey, and I won't go into detail here. It is basically everything higher education and higher education policy. And in the report, we also make cross-references with other external reports, such as the ones issued by Eurydice in the context of the Bologna process, Bologna implementation report, which itself features trends data, and we feature vice versa. And there are others, such as IAU's flagship internationalization survey that they also carry out every couple of years. Now, today's webinar, we want to showcase some of the main findings of Trends 2024, and we will do so in 4 rounds, which we called Times of Change, Education Offer, Internationalization, and last but not least, Europe Matters. And most of these rounds will be started off with a little poll question where we try to pick up some of the questions that we actually asked in Trends and see whether you have the same opinion as the Trends survey respondents. So let's start with the first one, falling into the round of Times of Change. I would like to ask my colleagues to open the poll question so everyone can participate. Please let us know, what do you think has most impacted the higher education sector in the past 5 years? And you will see the results of this poll question coming in as you respond to it. I will give you a moment for this. We issued several options, but if you think none of these options apply, please also let us know what else could have mattered the most in the chat. Okay, we'll give you a moment. Very interesting. So polling very high are COVID-19 pandemic and digitalization, at the moment followed by economic developments. I'll give you just another moment to click on the one that you think is most applicable in terms of what has impacted the higher education the most, the sector in the last 5 years. Before then handing over to Michael, who will show us some data reflecting on the poll finding and Trends findings as well. Michael, the floor is yours.
Henriette, and good morning, everybody. I think this is really interesting, and you can see here the results that we got actually in the survey from the close to 500 higher education institutions across Europe. And you can see this really very much aligns with the answers that you gave us. We found this a very important question because when we tried to put together the questionnaire for Trends 2024, we had some difficulty to ask actually about what the situation is, because there have been so many dramatic changes over the past years. I mean, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. We had the war against Ukraine, and the energy crisis, and so I think this was an important question for us to see how some of the bigger developments that we face in society, how they actually impacted higher education institutions. And you can see, well, here digital and COVID-19 is very high on the agenda, but then also it's the economic developments and enhanced cooperation with other higher education institutions, which one could see also as a success of some of the higher education policies that have been launched over the past years at European and at national levels. Interinstitutional, transnational institutional cooperation has been very high on the agenda. I move on to, or zoom in actually, in one crisis, I think, which impacted everybody in society, and of course also higher education institutions. And that was, of course, the post-COVID-19 crisis. Now we collected the COVID-19 crisis. We collected the data in the first half of 2023. The the actual crisis, WHO declared its end in May 2023. So I think we were just out of it, and we asked institutions what they think has changed due to the crisis. And I think this was a bit of a surprise to us. I mean, we were prepared for blended learning, teleworking arrangements, and also a more flexible learning offer. But interestingly, attention to students' mental health and well-being turned out very high. And with further down, you will see also attention to staff's health and well-being. So this was clearly something which was probably not so much on the radar of institutions, which due to the COVID-19 crisis gained in importance. And it will be interesting to see in the next round in the coming years how this will actually contribute to change student services, but also impact the way how learning and teaching is provided. Another change that we assumed takes place is that universities have multiple missions. Of course, there are the two core missions of education and research. And some would say there are only these two ones, and the other ones are just alternations and derivatives of these two missions. But anyhow, we think it is getting, the picture is getting a bit more diversified. So we asked first institutions, what are your core missions? Your primary mission, is it research or is it education? And as you can see here in the graph on the left-hand side, most institutions would say that both are equally important. Some would say, well, actually education or research is a little bit more important. We, in our data set here, there's a bias towards education rather, which can be explained by the fact that the trends questionnaire is rather answered by vice rectors and leadership in charge of education than of research. But there are only a very few institutions which say it's education or research. So I think that is unchanged. But then when we look at, or when we ask at, in addition to these two missions, what are the other mission areas, mission foci that you prioritized, then I think we see some interesting developments. Internationalization and global outreach has been confirmed, which I think is interesting despite geopolitical challenges that we see. This is still on the top. But right along with it, the third mission and contribution to society, and then followed by innovation. Again, I think the strong emphasis on the third mission and contribution to society, it's not actually so surprising, but it's interesting to see that so strongly confirmed by so many institutions across so many different higher education systems. And a question that we also addressed in the report, how do you actually fare with it? And the answer has been mostly positive, but I think there is also some concern about the fact that there is it's not necessarily always a very strategic approach. So the question is, how do you set your goals there and avoid that you risk a mission drift? And also that the third mission is not yet always recognized in the general public and also by ministries. And the last point is also that there might not necessarily be a lot of resources. So a lot is probably done out of the engagement of staff and students, but without much resources. And with this, I hand over to Thérèse, who will talk about the education offer.
If I might intervene for one moment, Michael, before we hand over to Thérèse, there was so far no questions in the Q&A, and I would like to warmly encourage everyone to ask questions, but there is a comment on our findings and also on the poll result, and maybe Michael, you would like to briefly reflect on it. The comment comes from Sarajevo, and it says that yes, digitalization indeed important, but it depends where you are geographically. I think in the universities with lower resources, the digitalization has been difficult to notice so far. Do we see any geographical differences on this in trends or in other digitalization projects, Michael?
I'm not sure that we looked into that, but maybe Thérèse can come in also to help to answer this. But I mean, there are clearly differences. We know that also from previous studies, and that institutions in some countries are in a much better position when it comes to equipment structures, but also, and I think that's an important difference, which we also faced during the COVID-19 crisis, whether they are actually allowed to use digital means in learning and teaching. So are you allowed to do hybrid or blended classrooms and these kind of things? Yeah, so there are differences. With indicating that it is important, we also didn't want to say that it is without challenges, but we get back to that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Just briefly, to add briefly on this, I think there is indeed, the digital divide has been a real and is still a real issue. But also what we have heard and seen quite a lot, but not really as through trends, is the level of, the equity in terms of digital literacy. So relating to digital skills, how to use the resources you have, how to train your teachers to teach with digital, etc., etc. So it's also, I think it touches upon a major question in terms of inclusion, equity, etc. We don't have much more on that specifically on trends, but this is definitely something that we can notice throughout countries, regions, but also just between different types of institutions. Henriette, I think we have one question that has arrived that rather looks like a comment. Do you want to take it now or later?
No, it is on COVID, so I will post it. And the question, I can actually display it, is I don't think the impact of the cost of living crisis since COVID appeared as a significant change in the UK at least. This has been a major issue for students and has affected engagement and well-being. This would be a comment on the poll, but also the first graph that you have showed. Would you like to reflect on it, Michael, Thérèse?
I think this is perhaps broadly covered under the option that we offered about economic development. It's really an overall question of the means you can engage and also student means, cost of living, etc. But indeed, this has been a trend for quite a while now in some countries specifically. But I think it also relates to a challenge that we will point out later when we will talk about internationalization, is that the scarcity, the availability, for example, of affordable accommodation has been a huge issue hindering mobility, for example, for students in an international exchange context. Perhaps Michael would like to comment on this?
No, I think we haven't. Yeah, indeed, we didn't include that in our COVID question, but I think you are absolutely right. And it is indeed mentioned as a factor that also impacted student well-being. Yeah, so cost of living has been an issue. Accommodation has been an issue. I mean, we saw many challenges during the COVID crisis.
Thank you so much. There is another question which pretty much directly relates to the next part of the webinar. So for now, I will move on to the section on the education offer. Again, we have a little poll that is on your opinion on what has most changed in higher education with regards specifically to learning and teaching in the past 5 years or in the past couple of years. And actually digitalization is again one of the options, but then we also have things like more flexible learning, attention towards quality of teaching, diverse student body, and so on. So again, I would like to ask colleagues to display the results as they come in, and I will give you a moment to select one of the options here, or if you think there's one that we completely missed, please let us know in the chat. Yes, and as we can see here, also digitalization, again, featuring very high when it comes to learning and teaching specific changes in the last couple of years. But we do also have this will be followed by flexible learning so far, as well as innovative and active learning. So learning and teaching practices in times of change as well. Thérèse, with this, I would hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Henriette. So we'll go through a few major trends about learning and teaching, but also the overall education offer. I just would like to say already now that there is actually much more in the report. So I would warmly invite everybody, of course, to go and also dig into other trends that we have found. Let me just try to make this work. Yes, all right. I would like to first start by sharing some considerations with you regarding the students cohorts and the increases and decreasing in terms of student numbers in Europe. What we have noticed there is that, generally speaking, there's been a general increase of student enrollment in the past 5 years when we asked institutions who answered the survey, but we also could see that there were clear and noticeable differences between the countries. Notably in some Eastern European countries, Baltic countries, and also some Central European countries, in Germany, for example, there were noticeable decreases in student numbers, and especially particularly for degree education in the bachelor's and the master's. When we asked then for expectations, what would you expect for the next 5 years? Well, it's quite interesting, and I think it also collides with what Michael just mentioned before, is that we can see that clearly a huge number of institutions expect an increase of international students. In the survey, we did not ask for the volume of this, but just a general prediction that whether it will happen or not in the next 5 years. And this is the result. 77% of institutions did answer that they do expect an increase of international students. At the same time, half of institutions also expect an increase of learners in non-degree education. And interestingly, another quarter of respondents also said that they would expect stability, but they answered that in the past 5 years there's been already an increase of learners in underdegree education, and we can also see that 40% of institutions do expect an increase of mature learners. We did provide, of course, a definition of what we mean by mature learners in the survey, which was mature in terms of deferred entry into higher education. Compared to the time people obtained their secondary degree, education degree. So those are two quite clear trends for the upcoming years that institutions would expect in international students, and also recruiting mature and learners in non-degree education. They do have some strategies in place for that. This is the graph you can see in the middle of the screen, more or less. For international students, quite clearly so, for a vast majority of institutions. But what you can also see there is that in terms of strategies to attract students, institutions also do pay attention to what I would broadly call the equity, diversity, and inclusion agenda. So strategies targeting social economically disadvantaged students, for example, but also students with disabilities, students with refugee-like backgrounds from ethnic minority groups, etc., etc. What we shared in the report is, when we analyze those trends, some kind of perplexity as on the model, let's say, or processes to put in place for no-degree education and a more diverse student body, because what we observed is also a third of institutions actually have no information on how many those mature learners are, and also a quarter of institutions have no information on the student numbers for learners in non-degree programs. What we have found out is that registration can take place following different modalities within the same institution, and a little bit less than a half of institutions actually said that this is being managed at program, department, or faculty levels. So we can see here that there is still some pathfinding work to do, let's say, in terms of finding the right model to address registration, but also just the incorporation and general inclusion of these students in the overall student population in an institution. Let's accelerate a little bit. I would like to quickly talk about the implementation of the learning outcomes approach, because if we focus on students, we also need to talk about this overall paradigm that we have for learning and teaching in the European higher education area, which is student-centered learning. And you probably know that although an imperfect proxy, the implementation of learning outcomes has been taken for many years already as an indication of the implementation of a certain student-centered learning philosophy, at least, let's say. What we can see here is that about 70% of institutions did notice that, yes, they have been implemented for all courses, and some others also for some courses, so partial implementation. What might be interesting here to notice is that if we compare to the progression of in this implementation in the past years, so throughout the past trends editions, we can see that there's been no progress and perhaps a regression, but the percentage is minimal enough to also, I mean, it could be because of a sample bias or reasons like that, but at least there's been a stagnation, if not a regression, in the state of implementation of learning outcomes. What we can also see is that there are still quite some issues encountered in implementing learning outcomes. What might be interesting to you is the light blue column, actually, things that continue to pose problems, such as insufficient resources to support staff in implementing them, etc. I also have to say, to mention perhaps one thing here, is that it's not necessarily because some systems, some countries have a very mature approach to learning outcomes that have been implemented for all courses already for a long time, that institutions have no problems at all. So we also had a certain number of institutions in those countries saying that they still experience all kinds of problems across the board to implement learning outcomes. We can only conclude here that it's still, I mean, learning outcomes is still a very dynamic and lively journey, let's say, for learning and teaching. And that, well, obviously, those problems are probably not the same range than when learning outcomes were at baby stage. But still, it is a matter of progression more than full implementation being achieved all the time. Perhaps I'll move to my next slide. Yes. I said already that there was a big expectation from institutions to recruit, to be able to recruit, or at least to increase the cohort of non-degree learners, non-degree students. Here are some graphs that will exactly show you what we are talking about. First of all, I would like to note that this is not exactly a new trend. If you look at the graph that is more or less in the middle, but in the lower part, it's a graph from Trends 2018, so before the pandemic, and the last edition of Trends we had before this one. We can already observe that there was a clear trend towards growing demand for short-term and non-degree learning opportunities, enrollment and flexible courses that have increased in the past years, and also a growing demand for flexible arrangement for degree programs. So it's not exactly a new trend. Perhaps it has developed into also some kind of policy priorities. We talked a lot about micro-credentials recently, as you know. What we can see here is that the offer of non-degree programs or courses is actually already in place at 70% of institutions surveyed, which is quite a lot. And also we have a fair share that said, about 20% that said, yes, well, no, it's not there yet, but it is being planned. We have noted a few challenges related to implementing offering non-degree programs and courses related to funding, but also the funding model, finding a business model. Should that be paying? Should that be fee-based? Who's paying for that, etc. But also identifying the demand, and that's an interesting one, because this is really here that we can also see the interface between the interconnection between perhaps universities and society or future employers. Issues related to recognition, but also credit awards, and also in some institutions noted that they do still have a legal and regulatory obstacles at national and at system level. I think I'll finish here because the next one is already on internationalization. I'll give the floor back to Henriette. Thank you.
Thanks, Thérèse, and please do stay with me for another couple of minutes. There are several questions that came in while you were presenting, some of which I would like to pick up now and some of which we will try to leave for the end of the discussion or of the webinar, where we have another round of discussion, so to say. But maybe we start with the one that very much relates to what you had just finished on, which is on the rise of non-degree education, particularly micro-credentials. How do you see universities balancing the demand for short, flexible learning options with the need to maintain the rigor and integrity of traditional degree programs? Apologies. How might this shift impact the long-term mission of our universities?
That's an interesting one. Thank you, Yanis, for asking. I think this is a question that comes up from time to time when we talk indeed about micro-credentials and demand for short, flexible learning options. Perhaps I'll answer by 2 points. The first one, I don't think the fact to have shorter, more flexible learning options, and here we are already talking about 2 different things, and so flexible learning under curriculum and flexible learning offer in terms of non-degree short offers. I don't think the fact, I don't think being in a shorter program should necessarily mean, of course, that we are not being rigorous, quality assured and all that. But I think it very much touches upon a question of learning design, identifying the right purpose of such an offer, and also, as I mentioned earlier, reaching the right complementarity at the institution between what you would want to achieve with a degree program and what you would want to achieve with a shorter non-degree education offer. So this is a first point. And I had something else in mind, but I'm sorry, I'm afraid I don't remember right now. So perhaps I'll come back and comment on that later. But it's definitely, I see that as definitely a concern for many people out there, and rightly so. Yeah, okay, it will come back. Let's go perhaps to the next to save some time. Sorry.
No problem. Thanks so much, Thérèse. And I will actually move on to the next section of the presentation rounds and keep all the other questions for the discussion round. And hopefully we will have time for addressing all of your questions. Everyone, please remember to ask questions. You can upvote questions. And I have answered already some of questions in writing as well, which you would find under the answered section in the Q&A. But without further ado, we'll move on to the section on internationalization. And again, we have a poll here, a pretty straightforward one this time around. Is your institution, if you are from a higher education institution, that is, of course, likely to enhance its international activities in the coming years? And again, you should see the results coming in as you click on them. And I will give you a moment. Yes, so far we have a resounding yes, 75-ish% at the moment. And this will be the background for the next round of presentations, for which I will hand over to Michael, please.
Thanks, yes. And again, I think this mirrors what we also felt in the survey. So if you look at the results here, most institutions said that international exchange and collaboration remains a priority, and that they established structures and resources for a more systematic approach at their institutions. And also that their activity has increased over the past years, and that they want to increase it in the future. So this is all well beyond 50%, and also that it is a dedicated leadership portfolio. So we could not detect that there is less interest or commitment in international exchange and collaboration. asking them and then also about a particular issue that matters in the context of the European higher education and the European education area. So the mobility that they actually have and that the challenges that they observe, that they recognize with these mobility exchanges. And as you're probably aware, both the Bologna process and the European Union have committed to a 20% benchmark. So by 2020, 20% of the graduates should have had a mobility experience. And as we saw both in the EU context and also in the wider European higher education area context, we didn't achieve the benchmark, we failed it. And this is what you see mirrored here in the responses from individual institutions. So if we count it together, it's just probably about 13% here in our survey that achieved it for the bachelor, and it's 14% for the master's, which is for the bachelor slightly higher than what the Bologna process implementation survey tells us. It was, I think, under 10% for bachelors, and a bit lower for the masters than we had in the Bologna process implementation report. I think they had about 17% there of institutions, of countries which achieved it. Now you cannot really compare countries to institutions, but I think it just confirms the big picture that we see also shown in country level data. What is interesting is to look also into the reasons for that. And the economic one is clearly number one. So most institutions say students can't afford it. But then there are also still difficulties with credit mobility in some academic disciplines. And we had more detailed data on that in the survey. It's actually not that this concerns huge numbers of students, but overall it concerns still huge numbers of institutions where some students, sometimes probably very small numbers, have problems and the institutions can't really solve these problems. Differences in academic calendars still play an important role, and many students also face some kind of mental barriers. So it's not all about funding, and it relates to probably also the point that we made earlier about student well-being and feeling well and supported at campus. And the last point, which is really challenging a bit, the reforms that we have achieved so far, that it is still difficult to fit it into bachelor's and I think the second one, in master's and bachelor's programs. Interestingly, much more difficult at master's level and not at bachelor's level. So that doesn't quite explain then why the mobility numbers at bachelor levels are so much lower than at master's level. And the question is, what do we do next now? Where do we go from here in order to achieve the benchmarks? And they are currently under discussion. You saw that in the Bologna process. So the Bologna follow-up group just constituted a new working group on mobility and internationalization last week in order to follow up on that, not only to mend the benchmark and get to the 20%, but also to look at mobility and education and internationalization in a slightly broader context and consider the changes that took place over the past 10 years. And in the EU context, as you know, there has been an agreement now on 23%, and this includes also some blended exchanges. The question is, will that help us to get there eventually? And you can see here, there has indeed been a major increase in virtual exchanges. According to our survey before COVID, it was around 12% of institutions which used virtual exchanges, and it's now 52%, and another 20% plan to have them in the future. So I think that is a huge change, and probably we should pay more attention to that also at policy levels, and actually have a look what's happening there. On the other hand, we talk a lot about joint degrees and joint programs at the moment. But what we can see in our survey at the moment, it's many institutions have joint programs, but they tend to have low numbers. It's only 1/4 of institutions here in the survey that said that they had 5 or more joint degrees or joint programs. And for the rest, there is 1/4 which does not have any. Some stop to have them. For some, it's still not possible, but this is really a small number. It's, I think, 4% for joint degrees and 3% for joint programs. And some never had them, and this is about 19%. Yeah, but the question is, will we see there a major increase there, given also the strong emphasis that is put on transnational collaboration, also in the context of the European University Alliances? And that was my pitch here, and we probably have questions.
Indeed, Michael, we have questions. Okay. Very specifically on virtual mobility that you had just finished on with your last slide together with the joint degrees. We have a question, and I paraphrase this one, it's easier perhaps so we don't have to read the whole thing, whether universities, how universities can ensure that virtual mobility is not just a stopgap measure, but an integral part of their internationalization strategies, especially in light of those mobility challenges that you had mentioned also earlier on in your presentation.
Yeah, I think that's probably also an answer to the question that we had earlier on how digital and quality relates. I think there's a strong understanding that, a shared understanding that the virtual mobility, we don't like to use that. We usually talk about virtual exchanges, that the virtual exchanges do not replace physical exchanges, but they can, at least for most of the students, but they can be a nice complement, and they can help also to make mobility more flexible, in that you could have parts of your international experience online through virtual exchanges and parts in physical mobility. And I think they can also help to enhance the quality, as you're not just restricted to your 3 to 6 months or maybe 1 year when you have been abroad, but there are more flexible ways then of interacting between partner institutions and between groups of students. And I think this is what we have seen also in the strong response, how institutions reacted to virtual mobilities or blended mobilities. Before COVID, they were just used by a small fraction of institutions, or also people within institutions. I think it was really a kind of a niche, those people who fought for COIL and virtual exchanges. And we have seen that due to COVID, but also, of course, due to the fact that this has become an eligible activity in the Erasmus Plus program, there has been a huge increase. We know also from the data that this is not just so easy. So it's quite work and resource intensive for the institutions. So that has to be taken into consideration. But it definitely changed the way of how we understand internationalization compared to pre-COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thérèse, did you want to come in?
Perhaps just to add one short bit, as I understand the question is also about what about internationalization beyond mobility or even exchanges generally. Well, yes, there is an overall question indeed of how institutions strategize, let's say, what they want to do in terms of internationalization. And by the way, we have not really discussed that point, Michael, but if you think about 80% of institutions willing to recruit international students, it also means a lot of competition actually to recruit international students. So I guess there is here a question of really mission profiling and for institutions profiling themselves on that scene. But what is also, what we see also developing is your last point about education offer, how to get more international into the education offer you have. We can see that happening at the level of European University Alliances, but it also can happen in other contexts. And you mentioned the COIL before, which was more like a niche thing. But definitely it has also become a little bit more, I would say, generally accepted that this can happen, and you can organize so that it does. I guess we still have a lot to do in terms of strategies for internationalization, really. But the overall conversation of what was called and is still called internationalization at home has definitely gained a new revival since the COVID time, and perhaps also a little bit because of the COVID times.
Yeah, I think I fully agree here, Thérèse, and I think that's what I meant when it also brings the quality question in. So internationalization is not just about sending a student abroad for 6 or 12 months and then and that's it. I think we look at it probably with some more differentiation, and also have to think now of how to combine the different means that we have for internationalization.
Thanks to you both. And following on combining the different means, of course, Michael, you mentioned the joint degrees already, and I have a comment/question which I would like to pick up here as well. Paraphrasing again, there's someone who points out how much more additional administrative burden it is to set up a joint degree. Michael, you mentioned administrative burden, of course, in the context of virtual mobilities and so on. But our commentator here mentions that it might even be seen that joint degrees are really are more work than being worth the effort. What is your experience or opinion on this?
I think that is difficult for us to judge. Colleagues from the institutions have to speak on that. What we can see is that a large number of institutions continues to have joint degrees. So I think they are useful. And when you talk to colleagues who are on the joint degrees, they find that often quite work intensive and a lot resource intensive, but on the other hand, it's still rewarding and they use it. On the other hand, it bears really the question of how many joint degrees can you possibly have, and what numbers of students you would reach to that. So I think that's a question to be asked. Yeah.
Thérèse, would you like to comment on this, or shall we move?
I think Michael basically summarized it all. Perhaps just one bit I would like to add. I mean, my educated guess at least would be that at policy level, that's why the European Commission has proposed a blueprint for a European degree or a European degree label, in an attempt to make at least that part, but also for many other reasons, of course, a little bit lighter. We'll see how it develops, of course. This is still an ongoing process at policy level, but it has been recognized for already many years through literature and also experience sharing, etc., that this is one of the issues. So the question is really how institutions would like to use joint degrees and joint programs for their strategic purposes, and how many of those, as Michael said, is actually a relevant number against the effort, and what is needed to put them in place.
Indeed, we are excited to see that. We will monitor that closely.
Yeah.
Indeed, and staying with Europe, I would like to now give the floor to Thérèse. We have one final input slide on the area of future trends, future of the EHEA, and Europe matters indeed. And Thérèse, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will not speak for long because I think there are also still several questions and we don't have that much time left. I just would like to show you that one slide. We asked us about the importance of European strategies, initiatives and funding programs. So what importance the European, not only policy-making level, but just the general European action level, let's say, matters to you as individual institutions located in a national context, etc., etc. And actually, we were quite positively surprised by the outcome. Erasmus program comes first, high importance for 90% of institutions. I guess a little bit expectedly so, because institutions, I mean, the vast majority of institutions would have experienced working with the Erasmus program and getting some funding from the Erasmus Plus program in a way or in another. But then the real surprise for us really came from the number 2 in that list, which is the Bologna process. The Bologna process has been launched for quite a while already, and we know that the key commitment that the Bologna process has, although deemed implemented already, are still valid. But you may also think that some institutions, especially located in countries where the key commitment have been already fully implemented for years, the degree structure, QA, etc., would not grant that high attention to the Bologna process anymore. But still, it is there. It is there as a structuring European framework, let's say, for institutions. And then coming a bit down, we also have the Horizon Europe program for research, European research area, the European University Alliances, 67% of institutions, etc. So I think this is a good wake-up call, really, that Europe does matter for higher education institutions, and European strategies and things happening at that level do matter. I think I'll just finish here, because I actually would like to, I think we could have an interesting discussion on that as well, including with some questions if they are. So the floor is back to you, Henriette. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies. Thank you so much, Thérèse, for showcasing this very important graph. As you said, we were all very positively surprised by the amount of high importance that universities have selected here. I think we will just go straight into the questions that have been posed by our audience, perhaps also linking a little bit to the importance of the European policy level when answering them. But I will start with the one that has the highest number of votes, and that is on the correlation between digitalization and the quality of education. There were a couple of other comments and questions along similar lines. So would you like to reflect on this, perhaps starting with Thérèse? It's on L&T.
I don't know, Michael, if you want to start.
I can also start it. I think that's a good one. And the short answer would be it's probably still under exploration. And but I think what has really changed is that we have a less biased approach towards the issue than we used to have before. You could see that probably already during the last decade, this extra antiposition between those who were strongly in favor and those who were strongly against it and saw that as the end of education, and then many people in the middle who didn't probably quite know where to position themselves. This has melted down, and I think the COVID crisis and the experience that we had has given a strong boost to that. I remember that our Irish colleagues did a survey which found that I think it was under 30% or even under 20% of academics had actually experienced in online teaching before the COVID crisis. And I think we have no reason to believe that this was elsewhere different in Europe. So, and this has changed, isn't it? We have all been in it and saw its limits, but I think we saw some of its opportunities as well. And this is where I think we stand now. So it has been back to campus, that's true. But on the other hand, we also see that blended and hybrid learning and teaching is still something that is used. And as usual, if we are not pressed by strong pressures like the COVID-19 crisis, developments tend to be a bit slower, I would say, and more explorative. So again, something to monitor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'll go a bit along the same lines, but perhaps also adding a bit here. I think definitely I agree that there's a less naive approach to digitalization, and obviously COVID has played a big role as an incubator/accelerator here. But also it's less about, or at least not only about playing with the tool, than really this awareness about learning design, and that's I think a very important point. point, it's not about technology, it's about pedagogy. It's about how and what you exactly would like to make the student gain from that. What is the learning gain, how you would like to put it in place, and how also you would like to assess it. My second point would be that I think, and this is something we didn't have time to show, but is in the report, actually, I think also there is a less naive approach because institutions have already started having all kinds of guidelines and regulations, notably about ethics. So how to use also digitalization, and not being overwhelmed by it, if I can say it in that way. We all know about the debate we have about AI, the use of it, etc., especially for assessment. Well, I think it does call indeed for a profound reflection about assessment notably, and that's the learning design part, but also a part that is about what are the regulations, do you make them clear, is that transparent, how you can use it, how you shouldn't be using it. And we also have some numbers and data in the report about policies that are progressively and gradually, not everywhere, but still progressively getting in place for that.
Thanks so much.
Probably we could link it with the other question that was there about the geographies and digitalization. I think that's of course a valid point, and we are aware that the situation, we said it already, the situation is different in different parts of Europe, but probably also between institutions. But on the other hand, we have seen how technologies have become more prolific, and it's more widely used and more broadly used. So, and actually, the internationalization or the international exchange and collaboration is, of course, one of the areas where you absolutely need it nowadays. So that's as a short answer. We have to see how the legal restrictions that still are a problem in, I think, across Europe, but also in particular in some countries, how this will be tackled in the future. Yeah.
Thanks so much. We are unfortunately running out of time. I would love to pick up more of the questions that are here. They are very good ones indeed, but unfortunately we cannot. Because I wanted to give Michael and Thérèse the floor to summarize a little bit of what they had said, to reflect again on the main findings, but also looking towards the future, especially looking towards future trends in the context of the future of the EHEA, if they wish. So I would like to first give Michael and then Thérèse the floor before we will close this webinar. Michael.
Okay, yeah, it's not a summary, but just stating that we see many changes in the sector, also due to external factors that impact society, but also higher education institutions. And we mentioned some of them here: geopolitics, economics, the whole digital development, changing demographies. And there's probably, we might all feel that there is very little planning security here, also as we are still, in a way, impacted and marked by the C-19 crisis. But what we can also see very clearly, there's a growing emphasis on education and skills, but also of the third mission. And we think that we see also changes in what student population. So there are more mature students and a stronger emphasis on LLEL. And importantly, the continued interest in internationalization and mobility. And as Thérèse said, this is good on the one hand side. On the other hand, it might also be an area of competition. So that would be my resume here. So trends to be followed up then. Over to Thérèse.
Yes, well, to not repeat what you said, perhaps I just would like to outline 3 points that seem to me important to reflect on in the future, and those are also fully explained in the conclusions of trends. The first one I would note really from the data set we have is more and more missions and more attention to different missions at universities and areas of priorities at universities. And this is something that institutions, but perhaps not only institutions, have to think about really in terms of institutions being under pressure to demonstrate and also to show what exactly they offer and what exactly they do in that area, and to avoid the kind of mission overload and do more with less trap. The second trend, the second thought for the future I'm having here is really a quite genuine and proper reflection that needs to happen on the education are. I talked a little bit about the trends we have observed there, but yes, there are changes in the numbers and composition of the student body. There is really this phenomenon of rise of non-degree education, but more fundamentally, institutions really need to explore and further define what they would like to offer as education to their students and how they should that should be shaped in the future. It is about the role of institutions in lifelong learning, but not only. It's really about also what kind of student experience and what kind of role ultimately in society institutions would like to play with education. I'll finish with the third point, which is about internationalization, but much has been said already. But yet still, it is important. It's important because it is identified as a top priority. But we also feel through data we collected that there is still much to do to improve daily operations, but also the overall strategic approach. And again, this is not only for institutions individually, but also for generally the policy level. I will stop here, I think. Thank you very much to everybody for your attention.
Thank you so much, Thérèse and Michael. And with that, I would like to close today's webinar. I thank the attendants very much for joining us, for asking questions. I hope that we will have other opportunities to discuss our trends findings with you, perhaps even in person at one of our in-person events. Here on the slide is a little advertisement for the next couple of online events that we have. Amongst them, one on supporting researchers from Ukraine. At the beginning of October, we will have one on universities and knowledge security, end of October. And there's also a workshop that you still can apply to participate on artificial intelligence and universities. What's next? So with that, I would like to close today's webinar and wish you a nice rest of the day.